Libuše, Hanna, Veprek, and I would like to welcome everyone here to the ECSA 2020 side event about reinventing ethical review for citizen science. If you came here thinking this was the session about how to get tenure when all you really care about is doing good science, that one's a few doors down on the left. But next slide, please. We're very excited to have you all come here for a shared purpose today, which is to figure out our values with respect to citizen science. And so we'll begin with the talks listed here, describe some of the forum chatter, and then move straight into the discussion. We've got 1 hour, so our time is short. And we have no false ambitions about finishing this conversation, but our goal today is, of course, to begin the conversation. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn you back over to our esteemed virtual event director, Caroline Nickerson.
Yeah, first of all, welcome. As you can see, we have a really global audience here today. We have 98 people who registered, 26 countries represented, and 6 continents. So first of all, thank you to all of you. I know there's a really wide stretch of time zones here, so some of you are up late, some of you are up early, some of you it's right in the middle of your workday. And yeah, this is a global issue, so I'm glad that we have a global audience. So we just want to know a little bit about you before we start. We want to know your answer to this question. Should citizen science research have ethical oversight from an independent third party? And some of you may not be sure entirely what this question means yet. You're in the right place. You're in a place where you can learn. But go ahead and answer to what your opinion is on this. So we're going to launch the poll. So go ahead and get your votes in. Should citizen science research have ethical oversight from an independent third party? All right, we got some yeses coming in. We got a lot of it depends. I think we have a lot of academics in the audience. We have some unsures. No one has said no yet. Oh my gosh. So keep voting. I'll give you a few more seconds to vote. We have a pretty tight timeline today. So last chance to vote. We have one no. We have one sole dissenter so far. All right, 3, 2, 1. This is your very last chance to vote. Get those votes in. All right, we're going to end the poll. I'm going to share those results. So as you can see, we have quite a few yeses. We have 1 no. We have 57% of it depends, and we have about 9% people who are unsure. Great. All right, so now I'm going to hand it over to Libby, who's going to present for us. Oops, let me go back. Who's going to kick off our talks today. So Libby, take it away.
Thank you. So before we discuss the substance of ethics in citizen science, I would like to consider why citizen science might require different ethical treatment compared to other forms of science. So first, I'd like to show with an example how the current approach taken by oversight committees often doesn't fit citizen science because of key differences in the moral frameworks. And second, I'd like to show how the distinction between ethics, understood as the reflection of morality, and morals as a system of norms can be useful to this analysis. Next slide, please. So in research ethics, there's an ongoing discussion about whether researchers should return the results of a study to research participants out of respect for them, or if results should not be shared back because seeing them could cause harm. This controversy already shows that research ethics in general is an ambiguous field. Now, when citizen science research is reviewed by the same standards as clinical trials, it gets even more complicated and several problems arise. First of all, the questions of duties and roles emerges. For example, the role of citizen scientists does not fit in with the established understanding of research participant, since citizen scientists can be researchers, human subjects, or sometimes both at the same time. So this implies that new role understandings have to be considered by oversight committees. And secondly, for the different stakeholders, these new role allocations come along with different ideas and expectations. For example, David Resnick shows that if the role of citizen scientists exceeds being a mere human subject, they may feel more connected and hence more ownership over their collected data. Next slide, please. So I now want to turn to the question of ethics in citizen science. We are, of course, by no means the first to discuss this topic, and in this workshop, we build on important and valuable insights from authors like Anne Bowser, Karen Cooper, and Lisa Rasmussen, to name but a few. However, it seems to me that sometimes in discussions in the citizen science community, we often do not consider what ethics exactly refers to, and we use the terms ethics and morals synonymously. Although I do not intend to get tangled up in definitions of terms here, I think differentiating between morals and ethics might help us more easily identify a common understanding of ethics for citizen science. Next slide, please. Thanks. So what do we understand by ethics and morality? In everyday life, morality and ethics are used synonymously to describe the good in contrast to the bad, or to distinguish between right and wrong. In contrast, in ethics as a branch of philosophy, ethics is often seen as the philosophical study of morality, as philosopher John Day describes it. Now, if ethics is the reflection or the study of morality, the next question obviously is, what is morality? And according to the German philosopher Dietmar Hübner, moral is a system of norms whose subject is human behavior and which claims unconditional validity. Next slide, please. So this means that different morals exist in very different contexts, such as different cultures or political currents, and there even exist different morals for specific groups of people like doctors, journalists, and scientists. And these contextual morals mostly coexist, but sometimes they conflict with each other, like in the opening example of return of results. So this means that morals simply describes that a certain group or a community always follows a specific system of norms without judging whether that's right or wrong. So it would be correct to talk about the morals of the mafia, for example, also if we don't agree with this system of norms. To decide whether this moral is right or wrong would then be part of the reflection of normative ethics. Next slide, please. So the aim of differentiating between morality and ethics is about the perspective we take on ethics and citizen science. We can now relate to two different layers that have to be considered. The first layer consists of the moral framework. We need to understand what the moral values of the different stakeholders in citizen science are. For example, what is important to citizen scientists and what do they expect from their participation? And this can then inform the second layer, which consists of reflecting this moral framework in a set of ethical guidelines. And these could both guide the design and execution of citizen science projects, as well as evaluation by oversight committees. Of course, these ethical guidelines would always need to remain flexible, as we may discover that values that apply to most citizen science projects may still be ill-suited to certain specific studies. Next slide, please. So I started with the example of return of results, which is but one example for a research ethics value that may be different in the case of citizen science. However, there are many other topics waiting to be discussed, such as the question of data ownership and intellectual property. But I would like to leave it here, and I'm curious to hear your perspective on these values and on which other values are important in citizen science. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Libby. And if anyone has thoughts on these and you can't wait till the discussion, put those in the chat and it kind of gets us primed for that. Next, we have our speaker, Pat Seymour.
Good day. Please keep in mind that my comments are mostly from an American or United States perspective. So I'm not trying to be all-knowing, but that is my perspective. I feel like sometimes I forget that there's other kinds of ethics review, so please excuse me. Next slide, please. So when assessing a study, there are two definitions that IRB analysts and reviewers must consider. And that is the study research, and does the research involve human subjects or participants? And at this basic starting point, I believe that citizen science begins not to fit the mold of traditional research and IRB ethics committee review. I don't believe that individuals involved in citizen science are research participants or subjects. Next slide, please. So this is the traditional model of how, at least here in the United States, we treat human subjects or participants. And in fact, in the US, we can't even agree on whether or not they should be called human subjects or participants. But as you can see, the human subject is in the center and everybody else is around them, and their responsibility is to protect that human subject. So individuals who are engaged in citizen science are more aligned because of their position of autonomy with researchers and sponsors. They are active and independent from the traditional role of subjects, as can be seen in this figure, who are thought to be in a position of relative vulnerability within a research project, and that they need independent protection because of this vulnerability. My understanding of citizen science is that there exists an exchange of information that is based on collaboration and shared interest or desire to contribute. Next slide, please. So why would citizen science need an independent review? Well, there's a few practical reasons. Not every project is the same, and not all may require an independent review. Some circumstances may require some need review, but not oversight. So by oversight, I mean regulatory or legal oversight. And at this juncture of required oversight, helpful consultation might be more preferable than an actual IRB review, an IRB meeting independent research committee or research board. But because of this misalignment in the, we offer an alternative mode. So we're not saying that there's never going to be a chance or an opportunity or a need for independent third-party review. What we're saying, or what I'm saying, is that it's not always one size fits all, and it might not always be necessary or desired. Next slide, please. So what we've been working on for the last couple of months is a model, and Libby talked about the framework, and that's how I'd like you to think about what we're proposing here. So the first step is perhaps an ethics navigator who could provide insights on project readiness and identify early issues while the project is in development. And by this, I mean someone that can actually say, well, you know, if you do it this way, then you might not need a formal ethics review or IRB review. And then also at the same time, we would also offer a small group consult based on the researcher's identification of questions or issues. And then we would have actual citizen science representatives who could also weigh in on feasibility. Will this work? Is this possible? And then we have people, and we have an opportunity to provide information about traditional ethics, IRB review, if it is necessary, based on the consensus of the various contributors. Next slide, please. And most importantly, in my mind, is this feedback loop that's going to create the standards and policies and the framework that Libby referenced. I think we should have published evolving information about ethical consults, the results of them, some of the issues that were discussed, and these should be posted so that researchers can view past consultations and pathways. And this is sort of a real live, transparent effort to share the work that we've done prior. And then I also think that we could have some kind of a blog or some kind of exchange where we can easily view what the best ideas or practices were when we were going through various consults. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing what you think about this.
Thank you so much, Pat. Next up, we have Karen Cooper from North Carolina State University.
Hey, thanks. Well, I'm the PI on a National Science Foundation funded project with Lisa Rasmussen and Elizabeth Jones, and we're engaging practitioners, citizen science practitioners, to co-create norms for data ethics. And we're focusing on practitioner behavior, not volunteer behavior, in the context of this project. And in the US, and I guess perhaps elsewhere, there's the most common ways currently to instill professional conduct include things like workshops and training and some sort of oversight committees. But what's known to really work best for ensuring ethical behavior are two things. And one is sort of more of an educational approach to help people understand the ethical decision-making process. And number two is professional norms. But with citizen science, there's so many different, it's like a blending of so many different professions and different practices that come from those professions that we're struggling with, well, whose norms to adhere to, right? So for example, ecology emphasizes data openness. Public health often emphasizes data privacy. And we don't really expect any one-size-fits-all answer for what projects might look like, but we want to build norms around this. And if you go to the next slide. Thanks. So we're focusing on practices related to data ethics, if you will, because volunteer contributed data seems to be like, it's the most common denominator across all the different types of projects that we see in citizen science. So many different types of styles of citizen science. And we're focusing on these particular aspects: data openness, privacy, transparency, credit, and return of results. And a little bit to address what Chris has been saying in the chat or others, when we prepared this proposal, we were not responding to some problem or saying that there's like tons of ethical problems already like at the surface in citizen science, but we are trying to be proactive in helping develop these norms before there's a problem. And I guess if anything, it sort of arose from our perceptions of a mismatch between the type of oversight IRB can provide for human subjects and the type of oversight that would be ideal for citizen science projects. So if you go to the next slide. So like I said, we're focusing on norms and co-creating those norms together with practitioners. And one sort of foundational norm that we think will help is acknowledging that ensuring trustworthy data is not just based on technical solutions. In the field at the moment, there's a lot of emphasis sort of on how we get reliable data, on data quality, on fitness for use, and it's often focused on the technical aspects of those data. And we want to expand that norm to really say that actually to have trustworthy data means that it's technically has rigor, but it also has that it's collected ethically, and that there's a sort of ethical rigor with it as well. So good data are data that are collected responsibly. If you go to the next slide. And so just briefly of our process, we're carrying out an inventory, like sort of a web scraping of what the practices that are apparent from looking at projects and their websites. We currently have an inventory of over 400 citizen science projects. And so we're examining what practices are apparent from that. And then at the same time, we're running focus groups. At the moment, we have a bunch of focus groups. These are virtual. We invite people to participate in these. I'll give a little more information on that in a minute. And then those will be followed by, well, so the focus groups basically are to brainstorm ideas on what kind of tools and resources are needed to support the norms for this community. And then the workshops will be to build those. And then our research team is doing pre and post assessments. Can you go to the next slide? That is focused on the theory of planned behavior. So we're looking at attitudes toward different practices in citizen science, norms, perceived norms, and efficacy toward those norms, as well as behavioral intentions for different practices. Anyway, so basically what we do in the workshops, if you go to the next slide, is we often will compare the outcomes of that pre-survey that everyone's taken before they join the focus groups. And that's sort of what people's attitudes, norms, efficacy, and intentions are toward particular practices. And then we compare those on a given topic to what the inventory is showing are the actual practices right now. And what we're seeing oftentimes is a big disconnect. And then we look at where that disconnect is coming from. Is it coming because of different attitudes, because of a lack of norm, or because of a lack of efficacy? Anyway, so if you want to learn more about that, you go to the next slide. You're invited to take part. You can learn more at the website here, the Citizen Science Association's website under Data Ethics Study, or you can email us at citizenscience_data_ethics@ncsu.edu. And then I was going to briefly, I don't know where I am with time, talk about, if you can go to the next slide, just 3 citizen science projects that I recently had very different IRB experiences with. And I thought I would just mention those briefly. One was Sparrow Swap, where volunteers who monitor bluebird nests would send eggs from an invasive species, the house sparrow, to the museum where we would curate them and look at heavy metal content. The IRB felt we should have participants remain anonymous. The consent had aspects in it where they were really just responding to risks that were part of their normal bluebird stewardship anyway. But it was considered exempt because we had this anonymous. Because the participants are anonymous, I can't publicly acknowledge or thank them for their participation, which would be a nice norm to have in a citizen science context. Another project that we did called Sound Around Town, volunteers were to place listening devices, recording devices in their backyards, as well as carry out listening sessions. Because these devices were in backyards where they could record what's happening in neighboring yards, there needed to be a third-party consent, meaning neighbors had to consent also. And so in this case, our primary participants could not be anonymous, right? Because their neighbors, they had to know where the device was.
We're about out of time.
Okay. Do you want me to just stop?
Maybe give us crowd the tap and then we'll move on to our next speaker.
Okay. Well, anyway, there was issues with, so anyway, that one required annual renewal, which I guess I won't go into. And then crowd the tap, what we decided to do there was actually give participants the choice when they join, that they can choose to make their name public, not tied with their data, or they could choose to have a confidential status. And one of the odd things in our consent form, I think, that IRB wanted was that one of the outcomes of the project is people might learn that they have a risk of lead in water based on the type of pipes they have, which we thought was a benefit of the project, but which IRB thought was a risk. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. And if anyone's interested in that, maybe ask Karen a question in the discussion and be like, could you compare those 3 projects you didn't have enough time to talk about? But thank you so much, Karen. Next up, we have Stephen Rosenfeld.
Morning. So I have very short period of time to review the history of ethics in the United States. So I'm going to make my arguments based not on ethics or morals, but on utility. And I think the goal here for citizen science is to avoid being regulated. So I think ethical review is very important. And what I would urge is that we develop a way to proactively take care of that so that we're not told how to do it. And as an IRB professional, I can tell you that, IRBs are perfectly suited for clinical trials, but we review a lot of other stuff. And it's really sometimes, it's perverse in some ways to apply the requirements for what has to be in the consent form and what you have to review to these things for which the regulations were never written. So I think the only way to avoid that, for those of you, again, I have a US perspective, but for those of you who are familiar with the history of ethics, bioethics in the US, the regulations, there was a lot of awareness of unethical research. Regulations were only put in place when we really had some gross and obvious violations that got people in the gut. That was the Tuskegee study, which I don't have time to go into. It led to convening a group, the National Commission, which produced a report, which I would urge you all to read. It's very short, but it sets out an ethical framework with 3 principles: respect for persons, which is essentially autonomy, and for people who can't exercise autonomy, additional protections; beneficence, which is wherever possible, don't do harms if they're not necessary to the research, and maximize the benefits in the research. I mean, much of this is common sense. And then justice, which is perhaps the most problematic these days, which is fair distribution of benefits and risks, benefits and opportunities. And I would urge people to think, at least in the United States at this moment, justice is a big issue, because it's not just a question of who gets access to a drug, it's a question of participating in a social enterprise. So this is, I think, a very useful framework. We don't have to start from scratch. You can actually fit most things into these categories. And then very briefly, I thought of some examples of where citizen science could transgress if we're not careful. One is, if you have a citizen science project designed as a game. People play games for all sorts of reasons. Certainly games can be designed to be not much fun, so you only play them out of altruism. They can be designed, if they're well designed, they're compelling. And I think, if the purpose of the game, the ultimate knowledge is to be applied to something like assisted reproductive technologies, or something that people have strong feelings about, it's incumbent on us to make sure they know exactly what they're contributing to when they participate. And that would fall under respect for persons. Another one is, of course, a lot of this stuff goes on digital devices. There's a huge issue in biomedical research now about big data. And the fact that you collect a little bit of data in your experiment, it looks anonymous, it looks fine, but you can buy a commercial database which will allow you to re-identify everybody who took part. And so there are things like that which come into beneficence, and also respect for persons. And then obviously justice. If you think about the fact that participants, say you're using digital devices, aren't necessarily representative of your population, are the results you get out then generalizable? Would they be different if you were broadly represented? Do we have a duty to put resources and effort into having a representative sample of citizen scientists, so that anyone who wants to participate is actually able to? And that's a question not just of generalizability, but also of justice. So I think, the framework is very useful. These are questions that we just should start thinking about, so we avoid having the decision eventually made by others. And my last remark is just, I'm, and this is a bit of an epiphany listening to everybody this morning. I'm a latecomer to this field. But I think, there's been a move in traditional science to identify what we used to call human subjects as participants. And as I look at some of the projects that Karen showed, I think there's a continuity here between, it's a continuum between subjects, participants, and citizen scientists. And I think, we have to be sensitive to that. It's not always going to be a clear boundary. Anyway, I'll stop there. My time is short.
Thank you so much. All right, next up we have Pietro. He's going to speak for 5 minutes, and then we have our discussion.
The old unmute. Now this is always gets me. It's just, this is truly amazing. I just want to quickly say I've already learned so much just from these brief talks, and it's such a privilege to have such an interesting group. There's this fascinating, rich conversation going on in the chat, and there's this rich content, and we've got citizen science practitioners. We have world-class IRB experts with Pat Seymour and Stephen here joining us. It's just I think for me so far there's just going to be so much, I think, to follow up on after all this, and really appreciate all the links people are posting in the chat, references to other studies and materials. It's really great. So anyway, this talk, the last one before we start a discussion, integrates much of the thinking from some of the preceding talks to describe a vision and a concrete project underway to address the needs of citizen science ethical review. Click. Thanks. Traditionally, IRB has often been compulsory and seemed like an adversarial process where reviewers were there to poke holes in your ethical approach and eventually return a judgment. No offense to our resident IRB experts, but in our experience in working with Pat Seymour as our contact for an IRB application, we realized, thanks to her depth of engagement, that this process could be completely recast as a collaborative one. Click. In which the role of the IRB expert is to help the researchers align their methods with established ethical guidelines. Click. So in the traditional model, an application is filled out cautiously and word choices are carefully made to elicit an approval outcome, and then it disappears into a black box called the IRB process. Do I sound cynical? Where mystical and sometimes random seeming things happen until a determination comes out the other end. Click. And so we think full transparency is critical for building trust and working toward a shared goal. once you realize the IRB expert is there to ensure you meet your research goals while remaining compliant, then it's easy to welcome them directly into your project as a collaborator. Click. So in the traditional model, applications are isolated documents that get filed away and never seen again until it's time to renew. But that means that even if two projects by different researchers are very similar, they each have to go through the same time-intensive, sometimes expensive and laborious process. And we think that if your project is very similar to someone else's, then we only need to consider the parts that are different. Click. And click again, please. So in the old way, so to speak, there was a ready roster of mostly the same people who were on tap to review applications as needed. Click, and so we think the only time you need a panel is when there's something that isn't clear cut. And in that case, why don't we enlist our community of peers, including citizen science volunteers who have agreed to be on call? Click. So all of these things could, in principle, be accomplished in the absence of technology. Oh, sorry, I missed this one. Right, so yeah, there's one other aspect to this, which is that that we're operating, maybe this is the most critical point, we're operating on a set of outdated ethics. So I don't know if you're familiar with this red flag law, but it was the case that with the introduction of the horseless carriages, that otherwise known as motor vehicles, that there was a law enacted, I think in Great Britain, where someone had to walk 60 feet in front of the vehicle, waving a red flag to warn everyone that it was coming. I think it would be kind of funny to do that today, but anyways, you know, there are these you know, just to sort of illustrate that these things can sometimes not make sense as times change and context changes. Click. So we envision you know, a more dynamic approach to this, where we can, where the community can regularly revisit and revise our set of ethical guidelines. Click. So, so I think we have an opportunity today to build a technosocial platform that makes this vision a reality. And we can apply our own experience and methods related to engaging volunteers in online citizen science to figure out the right division of labor between humans and machines for such a platform. And we've actually already started to build this. It's part of what we call Civium, a data science ecosystem that's being designed for the advancement of citizen science. And both in terms of research and applications, to make those things more trustworthy, more transparent, and more sustainable. So for starters, we created an experimentation toolkit that lets you clone your citizen science project with a single click, so you can have this sandbox version where you can run experiments without affecting the live platform or the data quality that goes back to the domain researchers. So now imagine in this sandbox environment of your citizen science project, you want to run an experiment where you're actually studying the behaviors of the citizen science volunteers. So in this case, volunteers are not working alongside scientists analyzing data. They're being studied by scientists to help improve our understanding about how to design effective citizen science platforms. This configuration, which goes beyond traditional citizen science, might suggest a need for ethical review. So then how do we make that process quick, informative, and painless? So we're integrating a new IRB process into the Civium environment. And that means that instead of packaging up a description of your experiment for an IRB expert, the expert can come into the sandbox with you and look at your experiment, poke at it, try it out, you know, see how it'll actually work. And they can make comments and they could suggest edits directly on it in support of aligning your research goals with the community's current ethical standards. So they're basically there to shepherd the review process and activate various assistive mechanisms as needed in service of that goal. Click. You know, meanwhile, the system can log the issues that arise and the dialogue around those issues, as well as any implemented solutions. Click. And these are made transparent and accessible in a repository that connects these to a snapshot of the sandbox itself. this introduces something completely new and powerful to ethical review. Something that we demand for our legal system, something we aim for in scientific research, but it's missing in IRB. And that's the notion of reproducibility. Click. So when questions arise that are not addressed or that are ambiguous under the current set of ethical guidelines, then the IRB expert can invoke members of the community to review the issues. So this is kind of analogous to a section editor for an academic journal finding reviewers for a manuscript. And the platform can help manage the recruitment of those community contributors. Click. And so finally, and I think, whoops, back one, thanks. The outcome of this process can not only resolve the ethical dilemma for researchers, it can inform amendments to the ethical guidelines themselves so they can continue to grow with our understanding of citizen science and fit the needs and circumstances of our community. And this is something we've been working on, but we'd love to know what you think about it because we want to make sure it works for all of us. But we can talk about that later in the forum. So now it's time to begin our discussion about citizen science values. So I'll pass you back to Caroline for some instructions.
Awesome. Yeah. So everyone, quick disclaimer, this is an art and not a science. So we're going to do our best to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak and to be on camera. But to do that, we're going to rely on having you raise your hand or putting your thought in the Q&A function. And you can do that via the Zoom controls. So you see these on the slide. They're also on your screen. So in the chat, which I know you all have been using, we've been seeing a bunch of messages throughout. Maybe we'll read out your answer. Pietro is going to moderate the session. So maybe he'll say, oh, wow, I see that Christopher Kaiba in the chat posed a really interesting question about X, and he might read that out. Whereas if you want to make your point and actually speak it, Pietro would have a chance to call on you if you raised your hand or put your thoughts in the Q&A section. So just keep those Zoom controls in mind. And also we are recording this, and this recording will be shared after the session. So keep that in mind too as you decide whether or not you want to be on camera. And I'll copy and paste these instructions a few times and put them in the chat as reminders throughout. But we're going to stop sharing our screen because we're going to have different people on camera, and we have about 15 to 20 minutes for this discussion. So I'm going to let Pietro take it away. Pietro?
Great, thanks, Caroline. So yeah, I hope to see some questions posted in the Q&A. I think what we'll do is we'll begin. Maybe Caroline, could you just go to if we have a slide with some of the forum dialogue here.
Ooh, one really important point before we get started on that. Back on the art and not a science point, not everyone may have a chance to speak, right? But everybody has a chance to join the conversation in the forum. And I'm going to put this link in the chat, but if you go to the link at the bottom of the screen, so bit.ly/sit-sci-ethics, you can keep the discussion going there and hopefully have a vibrant dialogue. So back to Pietro.
Great, thank you, Caroline. So I think this was one of the first questions that we posted in the forum, just to start to seed the conversation. Under what circumstances should citizen science projects undergo ethical review, and why? So this kind of assumes an "it depends" answer to that question in the poll, and we did have some interesting responses here. So I think the first quote is, I guess I would say that any project should undergo an ethical review if it's possible in any way that some harm might come to the participants through their participation in the study, which I think speaks back to what Stephen's notion of beneficence. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, please, Stephen. It seems like there's kind of ingrained in us some of these principles that Stephen referred to as common sense about a basic moral framework, and then we're starting to apply these to this context. So someone in the chat, I think, asked the question, hey, has anyone seen something in a citizen science context that seemed ethically questionable? And I think I did see a lot of examples come up about you know, ethical issues or considerations in citizen science. And I think those examples serve as very useful use cases that help us think about this. So I'd love to hear from folks about any of these examples, or, you know, any other questions or comments you might have based on what we've been talking about.
Maybe to kick it off, would one of our panelists like to ring in on this? Maybe Stephen? Looks like you're mute. Oh, the old unmute. Maybe Karen, could you? There, Stephen's good. Okay.
Yeah, you know, this reflects some of the things in the chat. I think that that's fair. If there's no possibility of harm, it's not clear. Well, I don't know that it's fair, actually. So at first pass, if there's a possibility of harm, I think that should require some kind of review. And I think we've learned from history that the people designing studies and the scientists, even if they're citizen scientists, don't always see the harms that can occur to themselves or others. That's not what they're thinking about. And that's not a criticism, it's just a perspective. I would say, though, that the only other issue that may arise is justice. I think that access and justice, even if they're not overt harms, they're kind of harms if people are excluded from participation. And at least in the United States, we're playing catch up. And I think just coming to grips with how people have been harmed by exclusion for so long. Obviously, that's a country-specific observation, but that's, I would say those two things. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yep. Thanks, Stephen. Yeah. So I'm not sure if Q&A is working, or because
it is. No one's put anything in there yet.
Okay. Well, I know we have a room.
Christopher Kaiba raised his hand, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen because we're going in the video now. Great. And we're going to promote him to panelists so he can talk and speak. Welcome, Chris. He's migrating over. There he is.
You see me?
Yep.
Great. Yeah, so just two thoughts I thought I would throw out. One is that a lot of the whole discussion really so far has been from the perspective of sort of a classic experiment where a researcher designs the experiment and citizens take part. And there you can imagine it works, or it makes sense to do a review. But when it comes from a more citizen-led perspective, as in the second example that was just on the screen, or also I think in co-design, where, you know, at the start you don't necessarily know what you're going to do. There's no moment that then, like we're co-designing a project right now, and I don't see when we would have done an ethical review. So we're trying to think about ethics the whole way through, and I think this was part of the discussion about norms rather than necessary a review. I also wanted to throw out a point that I think will be really interesting for a lot of people, is this TEQ for One citizen science project in Germany, where people with type 1 diabetes have built do-it-yourself artificial pancreases and are treating their diabetes themselves. They have a hashtag called "We Are Not Waiting" because they're not satisfied with how companies are managing and how slow the process is to get artificial pancreases. And when you go to meetings where there are people representing medical places with the people from TQ for One, you see like exploding ethical concerns. So it's not, I thought that would be an interesting point that maybe some of you haven't heard of, and you could look into it if you're interested.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher. That's fascinating, and I think it raises one aspect of this whole discussion, which is that, you know, there's sort of a variable scope in terms of what we all consider to be part of citizen science, and these N of 1 studies and the resultant kind of medical approaches then starts to eke into the territory, I think, of what traditional IRB was created for in terms of regulating you know, medical devices and that kind of thing. And it raises a really interesting issue of, you know, should I be stopped from creating a device to help myself? But I think that's, you know, from my framing, that's kind of on the periphery of what we often talk about as citizen science, but that's just my own perspective. But I think it is a very, I think that could become a discussion all by itself. I can sort of imagine how those conversations go. Does anyone else?
Pietro, we had
Yeah.
Bastian raise his hand, and after that we have James.
Great. Let's hear from them, please.
Yeah, so I just actually wanted to to the points Christopher made. So we are working with a community of open APS users who build artificial pancreas and are collectively as a patient group collecting data about this. And just to point out why they went this route to do it themselves and make the point a bit more is that basically thanks to FDA regulation, there are no artificial pancreas so far for diabetics that they can use. So they built it themselves actually and made open source hardware and software for it. And just to the point that you also raised about the co-design and when to apply for ethics approval. So I know we are collaborating with a group at the Turing Institute in London, and they got ethics approval actually for their co-design methodologies themselves. So they are working with autistic people, and they actually got IRB approval for this is how we would do co-design with a group of potentially of autistic people who might get to harm during the co-design process. So basically you say, this is what we will do. This is how we run our workshops. And you do this as a first approval before actually applying for ethics approval for the final study you did co-design. So that's the way they try to solve it, just to give an idea there.
Fascinating. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Bastian. That's,
and then next
yeah,
we have
go ahead.
James.
Hi, just like to say, this is fascinating stuff. I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. So a lot of what we're talking about are perhaps more academic-y research. I work for a NGO, a charity. So first in the UK, we don't fall under the normal ethical process that universities go through. So we have to come up with our own ethical process within the company, which seems a bit crazy when we're such a small institution. But we have to obviously actively fundraise. So I was wondering what the panel's thought were on the tension between fundraising, asking all participants for money. So we obviously within the NGO, we have a lot of tension with the commercial side of things. So they just want to ask all the volunteers for all the money they ever own. And obviously there's a tension there where you're not only are you asking people to help you with your science, but you're asking them to pay for the luxury of doing it. So I wondered if the panel had any thoughts about how we tread this line.
Looks like Stephen might have something to say about that.
Yeah, so there's a committee in the US called the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections that advises the Office of Human Research Protections in our Health and Human Services on the research regulations. And that committee recently took up the question of paying participants, charging participants for participating largely in biomedical trials. And it's very fraught. I mean, it can it's not, there are reasons to do it. So the committee didn't say don't ever do it because sometimes it's the only way to get research done. But I think it has to be done really, really carefully because it can certainly have an impact on the science as well as the ethics.
Yeah.
And I know Gaston indicated he wanted to talk too, but we'll let Pietro respond to that first.
Yeah, thanks. Well, just quickly, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think there are two ends of this continuum. There are projects. Actually, Karen might know better than I do. It might be Feeder Watch, where participants actually, pay a subscription to participate in citizen science. So they're not just contributing data, but they're helping to keep the project alive. And then I've also heard voiced, I think, in the forum, this question of, I'm happy to volunteer to do citizen science, but I wouldn't mind getting paid once in a while for my effort. And I think it's a big question that we need to think about. And one of the issues, and then I'll stop, but I think one of the big issues that we worry about is on the research side, that what motivates someone to participate, whether it's intrinsic motivation out of altruism or wanting to contribute to science versus getting paid to contribute, as click workers do on Amazon Turk, really does affect the data quality in certain contexts. And so, that enters into the mix as well, I think. So yeah, can we go to the next?
All right, Gaston, over to you.
Thanks a lot. First, going back to Pietro's observation that the medical issues may be on the fringe of what we discussed, and I do see there are so many corners to the ethics debate that's in a sense true. But as a patient doing research, I think this is so incredibly large, this topic, at least within the healthcare debate. I just posted on the in the chat, we had an example of a 2.5 million Euro project, which was a co-led project between patients and academics. And we devised an approach which was according to us, an elegant combination of NF1 research and group research, but we failed to pass it through the formal institutionalized ethical bodies. And the argument that was being forwarded in the end was a very paternalistic one. And the fact was that patients should be protected from a research that supposedly would not generate enough information for the patients to benefit from. So there was a kind of a mixed up of old paternalistic views mixed with views on what a sound method is in medical science. Things become very blurred, and this project had to be aborted. So there's about €1.5 million being just thrown away because the institutions are not equipped with dealing new kinds of ethics and citizens claiming their autonomy in finding out what works for them.
So what do you propose as a prospective solution to that?
Well, what we first propose is just disentangle all the learnings that we have gained, because so much in it. So that's one thing which we obviously will do. But I was triggered by one of the things in your presentation, Pietro, about the community being involved in evaluating whether the ethics are going over some limits or not. And this is exactly what is not being done, at least in the Dutch medical ethical boards. It's even so that there's no patient at all present in these boards. So this obviously is a dimension that we have to take on board and have more views on what is considered to be an ethical project or not. So I like that approach you introduced.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain hubris involved. Well, and maybe not an overt one, but when a bunch of academics or learned ethicists come together to review these kinds of applications and projects, and there's not a single patient voice in the room, right? I mean, that feels just fundamentally flawed, because there's a patient perspective and they may not have all the domain expertise or the ethics domain expertise, but they know what matters to them as a human being. And I feel like we need that voice in the room. So one question or comment that came up that interested me is about transparency. And I think someone posted in the chat that maybe one way to sort of solve a lot of these problems is just to say, and I think it was in reference to existing projects and things, if there's transparency and informed consent, in a project, if people know what they're getting into, they've been completely, it's not just a link of privacy in terms that you never read, but it's really put in front of them. These are the implications of your participation. These are the privacy, this is how we're going to treat your data. Is that enough? Or are there certain situations where, there's an ethical standard that we should apply that says, you know what, even if people know, even if this is fully transparent, this is not the right thing to do, and we should not even offer this to anyone. What do people think about this? Where do we draw that line?
I know we're almost out of time, so we have Jonathan and then Alexis for our public people joining the discussion. So Jonathan, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I'm coming at this from the perspective of a citizen science game developer, and I was a community member for multiple years before I joined the project as a developer. And we started the process of trying to come up with our own community norms. And, we have a whole page and a half, we've started to kind of work out all the different kind of issues that we feel like we need to address. I've already come up with, a page and a half or more of things that we need to address that are all to some degree weighty issues. And certainly there'll be more. We've been heavily inspired by a paper by Kreitmeyer and Magnus that talk about basically how games, citizen science games, are extremely underregulated because the participants really, again, don't cleanly fall into a specific category of where there are existing norms and existing regulations where you have certain roles, certain responsibilities, certain protections, and citizen science game participants in particular really don't have any of those. So between, between being a researcher, a research participant, a subject, a research assistant. I don't know if I said that, or just a game player. So that's definitely we're kind of modeling some of our thoughts around the issue around that paper. And one of the things that they propose is using a deliberative democracy approach to try and work with the community to understand the community's values, and as a way of kind of coming up with solutions to these issues. And I'll just mention one thing in particular with as far as remuneration and financial compensation for work, is that it's important to consider that there are just general ethical implications of that, but also that, you also start looking at the issue of diversity, where you have some participants who are more or less able to access or to contribute because of their financial situation. And it becomes an issue of, well, for some people it might be fine to say, yes, my work is volunteer, and my any financial benefit from the contributions go back to the project. And that's kind of been somewhat of the assumption we've been operating under. But for some individuals, the situation changes quite a lot.
Yeah, the accessibility component, I think, is I've seen that come up in the discussion as well and on the forum. And I would love it if you're willing to share the list that you've generated in the forum, so we can all talk about, because I think part of your goal was to build conversations around that list and those questions, and link to the paper you mentioned. That would be fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, do we have someone else, Caroline, real quick?
Yeah, I think our last discussion person is Alexis, and everyone else, thank you so much for joining the discussion. And those of you who we couldn't give enough time or we couldn't get in here, join the forum definitely. But Alexis, you're going to close out our discussion.
Okay, well, there's been some discussion of this in the chat that I've seen, and it also ties into some of the things Jonathan was just saying. But a lot of times when you're working on some of these massive online systems, you don't know ahead of time who your participants are going to be. And it seems like there are different ways that different projects have approached not knowing whether their participants might be people in vulnerable classes, particularly children. But a lot of citizen science programs are targeted at children, especially the games, and especially like some of the more educational ones. So I wondered whether anyone had thoughts about how online massive citizen science projects can be more cognizant of some of the data privacy issues or some of the project design issues more upfront to help support those vulnerable classes in their participation.
I think that's a brilliant question. Yeah, thanks for raising that, and definitely I think a point for deeper discussion. I know that folks like Ann Bowser have written about COPA laws with respect to children participating, but I think you're speaking at not a legal level so much as an ethical level. And I think it raises this other question about citizen science versus gaming. So, in the gaming industry, there's all kinds of research that's being done on the people playing the games while they're playing the games in order to figure out how to make the games better. And of course, they don't bat an eye about that kind of doing those kinds of things. It's considered market research. But if we try to do something similar in the citizen science vein, because it's in service of scientific research, it kind of we apply a different standard to what we're doing. And so, I think that contrasting those two fields on this dimension that you raised would be sort of an interesting point of discussion. So I think we're just about out of time. Really great. I wish we had more time, but again, the point was to begin a discussion. Caroline's getting the exit poll ready, but before we leave, I just want to say there's been so much rich discussion also in the chat box that I think we can share that back with the community in various ways. We can email it to people who joined. We can put it in the forum, because I think there's a lot of stuff to go through and really examine there, and that can continue to fuel this conversation. So grateful to everyone for being here. Really grateful, especially to those who did it under some form of hardship or from a time zone that's in the middle of the night. And I think it's been just a very exciting discussion for me. I hope for everyone else. I know we couldn't represent everyone's voices, but that's what the forum is for. So let's continue the conversation there. And thanks again for joining. And
Yeah.
now, Caroline, if you could do the exit poll, that would be interesting.
We launched it already. About half of our attendees have voted so far. We still have that one no. I'm curious to know if it's the same person. So the question, it's the same question you saw the first time. Should citizen science research have ethical oversight from an independent third party? About 40% of you have answered yes. About 2% or one of you has answered no. About 54% of you have answered it depends so far, and one of you is unsure. So we have less unsures than the first time. So I think we may have clarified some things in this session, fingers crossed.
So I don't want to speak for the no, but I realized in the way we formulated the question, we said independent third party. And maybe that sounds like it's in contrast to a community of peers, of volunteers, of other citizen science practitioners, and so on.
We have a second no. We got one more person to say
okay.
no during this session.
All right.
Know.
Well, if anyone wants to just put in their reason for the no on the chat, no obligation, but we'll be fascinated, or we can continue that in the forum.
Yes, definitely join the forum. The link to the forum is in the chat. I'm going to close this poll in just a second, so get your votes in, get your last minute votes. All right, so let's see. I think almost everybody's voted, so we're going to close it up. So 3, 2, 1, last chance, and we're ending the poll, and we'll share those results.
Okay.
Some pretty good results there. A majority of it depends, so 54%, 4% no, 40% yes, and 2% are unsure.
Yeah. Well, I love it. We're a community full of opinions, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you all. Thanks again for joining, and looking forward to the next time we do this.
Yeah, and this is the link to the forum, as you can see it on my screen. Join the forum. We want to keep talking with you.
Okay. Thanks
all
again.
Right.
Yeah,
thanks
to all the
everybody.
panelists as well. Yeah, it's been great. Thanks.
All right, we're going to end it here.